I want to start today by looking at a specific document. It's a surveillance report from the Okhrana.
The Tsarist secret police.
Exactly. And it was filed years before the revolution, and it's tracking this one guy.
These files are always fascinating. They're so clinical, so detached. They aren't trying to write a horror story. They're just shift reports.
That's the perfect word, clinical. And in this particular file, they don't call him a monster. They don't call him a sorcerer or anything like that. They have a code name for him.
What is that?
They call him the Dark One.
Wow.
And they just track his movements. From this apartment to that one, they note who visits him, the women who come and go, the drinking, the late hours. But as you read it, you get this feeling that the police themselves were just baffled.
See, they don't know what to make of him.
Not at all. They're watching a man who, by every single metric of Russian society at that time, he just shouldn't exist. He shouldn't be possible.
And that, right there, is the perfect place for us to start. Because when anyone talks about Grigory Rasputin, we're almost always talking about a caricature.
Right. The pop culture version.
You see the long beard, the wild, staring eyes. You probably think of the Alan Rickman performance, where you hear that Boney M song in your head.
Rah Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen.
Exactly. He's the unkillable mad monk, the demonic figure who brought down an empire.
And look, that caricature is great for a movie, it's great for a song, but it's completely useless if you actually want to understand history.
It's worse than useless. If we just treat him like a wizard or some kind of cartoon supervillain, we stop thinking. We just throw up our hands and say, oh, he was magic, or, well, he was just plain crazy, and then we move on.
Which is...
Yeah.
It's lazy history.
It's incredibly lazy. And you could argue it's even dangerous, because Rasputin wasn't a supernatural force. He was a biological human being.
Yeah.
A man who was operating inside a very specific, very volatile social and political system.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to try to perform a kind of forensic dismantling of the legend. We are not here to just retell the sensational murder story. We will get to the poison, the bullets, and the politics in part 2.
Absolutely. That's a story in itself.
But for today, we need to answer a much, much harder question, a more fundamental one. Who was Grigory Rasputin before the world decided he was a monster?
And just as importantly, we have to ask why he could rise in the first place. I mean, think about it. In a country of millions upon millions of peasants, many of whom claimed to have visions, many of whom were seen as healers, why did this one specific man from the absolute middle of nowhere end up holding the fate of the entire Romanov dynasty in his hands?
To even begin to answer that, we have to ignore the ending. We have to rewind the tape. We need to strip away the brand name of Rasputin and try to find the man, Grigory.
And that means we have to start with geography. We have to go to Siberia.
Specifically to a tiny village called Pokrovskoye, and the year is 1869.
When you say Siberia, I think most people have this very generic image, right? Just endless snow, exile, maybe some gulags from later period.
Barren wasteland.
But the sources we've looked at, the ones that detail the logistics of 19th century Russia, they paint a picture of isolation that is, well, it's almost impossible for a modern mind to really comprehend.
Talk about that isolation. What did that actually mean?
It meant an abyss of distance. You have to put yourself back there. The Trans-Siberian Railway, which would eventually connect this region, it doesn't exist yet, not even close.
So how do you get there?
To get from the capital, St. Petersburg, all the way out to Pokrovskoye, we're talking about a journey of months. Months. First, maybe a river barge for part of it. Then you're on a horse-drawn cart bumping along for weeks on end.
And that's only in the good weather.
That's if you're lucky. For half the year, the roads simply cease to exist. They disappear.
The Rasputitsa?
The season of mud. When the snow melts in the spring or the rains come in the fall, the packed earth roads just dissolve. They turn into these impassable swamps of thick, sucking mud. The entire village is effectively cut off from the rest of the planet.
So if you were born in Pokrovskoye in 1869, you weren't just living in the countryside.
Oh, no. You were living in a time capsule. All the massive advancements happening in Europe, the Industrial Revolution, the scientific enlightenment, political reforms, none of that had reached the Tobolsk governorate. It was a different century.
And the sources describe the belief system there as, and I'm quoting, deeply religious in a raw, unsophisticated way. What does that mean, raw?
It means this isn't the high church theology you'd find in the grand cathedrals of Moscow. This is something older, something more primal.
More pagan, almost.
It's a blend, a mix of Orthodox Christianity, absolutely. But it's layered on top of centuries of pagan folk belief. So yes, God is real, Christ is real. But so are the leshy, the spirits that live in the woods. The devil isn't an abstract concept of evil. He's a physical presence who can trick you at the crossroads.
And life in that environment it's unbelievably fragile.
Everything is fragile. The harvest, your health, your children, one bad winter, one sick cow, and your entire family could be wiped out. This constant proximity to death, it shapes your entire worldview.
I want to focus on that fragility because this is what forges the man from nowhere. Rasputin wasn't born into power. It's so obvious, but we have to state it.
He was born into the opposite of power.
He wasn't nobility. He had zero formal education.
He was a peasant. Music. In the rigid caste system of Imperial Russia, that is the absolute bottom floor. You are legally tied to the land. Your life is a cycle of farming, trying to survive the winter, and, more often than not, dying young.
And to top it all off, he was illiterate.
Yes, for at least the first half of his life, he could not read or write a single word.
This, for me, is the first huge hurdle in really understanding him. I think in our modern information-based world, we equate illiterate with stupid. If someone can't read, we subconsciously dismiss them as simple-minded.
And that is a fatal analytical mistake when you're looking at Rasputin. In fact, I would argue his illiteracy is precisely what sharpened his other forms of intelligence to a razor's edge.
What do you mean by other intelligences?
Well, think about it. If you cannot read books, you can't store information externally. You can't look something up in an encyclopedia. You can't write a note to yourself to remember a name or a promise.
Everything has to be in your head. Your memory has to be perfect.
Your memory has to be archival. But it's more than just memory. Your entire intelligence becomes social. It has to be. You learn to read people because you literally cannot read text.
You're looking for different cues.
You have to listen. Really listen to the tone of a person's voice. You have to watch their body language, the flicker in their eyes. You have to navigate incredibly complex social hierarchies based purely on instinct and minute observation. You become a master of the unsaid.
This brings up a sociological point from the research notes that I hadn't really considered before. The idea of the Obshchina.
The peasant commune. Yes, this is absolutely critical to understanding his upbringing. We in the West often have this romantic picture of the frontier as a lonely place, a single log cabin in the woods.
The rugged individualist.
Exactly. But Russian peasants almost never lived in isolation. They lived in these tight, crowded, interwoven communes.
And that means there was zero privacy.
None. Absolutely none.
Yeah.
Slept in the same room, often on the floor or the top of the stove, with your parents, your children, your grandparents, and in the winter, often the smaller livestock as well.
Oh, God.
You knew everyone's business. There were no secrets. You knew who was cheating on their wife, who was stealing grain, who was telling lies, who was secretly devout. It was a human laboratory.
So Rasputin didn't just grow up on a farm. He grew up in a laboratory of human behavior.
Precisely. He spent the first 30 years of his life in a social pressure cooker. He learned how to spot a lie from across a crowded, smoky room. He learned how to leverage secrets. He learned how to hold a person's attention, how to be the center of gravity in a group.
So when he eventually walks into a glittering palace drawing room in St. Petersburg, he isn't actually overwhelmed by all the high society people.
Not at all. He's just seeing a different version of the village commune. The clothes are more expensive, the accents are different, but the fundamental human dynamics, the jealousy, the fear, the ambition, the lust, they're exactly the same. And he was a world-class expert at navigating those currents.
But still, the statistics are just. They're overwhelming. He should have stayed in that village. He should have remained invisible to history.
By all rights, he should have been nothing more than a statistic in a dusty ledger book. He should have farmed turnips, drunk himself into oblivion on feast days, and died in obscurity. The fact that he didn't is the great anomaly that we are trying to explain.
And that explanation so often begins and ends with one label.
The Mad Monk.
The Mad Monk, which is the very first myth that we absolutely have to tear down.
It's the headline on every tabloid article about him for the last 100 years. And yet, the official dossier, the historical record, is crystal clear on this point.
Grigory Rasputin was not a monk.
He was never a monk. And this is not just a little technicality. It is a fundamental, crucial distinction in the structure of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Can you break that structure down for us? Because I think to an outsider, a Russian guy in a long robe with a big beard, he just looks like a monk.
Of course. So in the Russian church at the time, you essentially have two main tracks for the clergy. You have the black clergy and the white clergy.
Okay.
The black clergy are the monks. They are the ones who take formal vows of celibacy, poverty, and obedience to the church hierarchy. They live secluded in monasteries. They are the spiritual elite, and the church leadership, the bishops, the metropolitans, they all come from this group. They represent the institution.
Then white clergy.
Those are your everyday parish priests. A key difference is that they have to be married to be ordained. They live in the villages with their families. They are the public functionaries of the church. Rasputin was neither of these.
He never took those vows. He was never ordained by a bishop.
Never. In fact, his life was a direct contradiction to monastic vows. He had a wife, Praskovia, and 3 children waiting for him back in Pokrovskoye. He was famous for drinking heavily. He swore like a sailor. He had countless affairs with women. His life was the polar opposite of a monk's.
Okay, so if he wasn't a monk and he wasn't a priest, what was he? What was the official category?
He was a stranic,
Which means,
a wanderer, or more accurately, a holy wanderer, a pilgrim. This is a category of religious figure that doesn't really have a neat equivalent in the modern West.
describe it.
Imagine a man who has consciously detached himself from the world. He has no home. He has no job. He has no master but God. He just walks. He walks from monastery to monastery, from one holy shrine to the next, living entirely on the charity of others.
It sounds a bit like a spiritual freelancer.
That is a fantastic way to put it. He was a religious entrepreneur. And because he was a freelancer, he wasn't beholden to the rules and regulations of the institutional church.
No one could tell him what to do.
A bishop couldn't fire him. A local priest couldn't silence him. He operated completely outside the official chain of command, which gave him immense freedom.
But I'm still stuck on the contradiction. How does the drinking, the swearing, the womanizing, how does that fit into being a holy man? You'd think that would immediately disqualify him. If I see a guy stumbling out of a tavern, my first thought isn't, I should probably ask him for spiritual guidance.
In a normal Western Christian context, you'd be absolutely right. But here we have to look at a very specific and controversial undercurrent in the Russian theological landscape of the time. We have to talk about the rumors surrounding a group called the Kleisti.
The Kleisti. Right, this name comes up again and again in the police investigation files.
They were a banned, underground religious sect, and their central theological idea was both fascinating and, to the official church, incredibly dangerous.
What was the idea?
Their core belief was in the concept of sinning to drive out sin.
Okay, you have to explain that logic. That sounds convenient.
The idea goes like this. You cannot achieve true, profound repentance unless you have truly and profoundly sinned. If you're a perfect, clean-living monk in a monastery, what do you really know of redemption? You're arrogant in your own purity. But if you deliberately descend into the pit, if you give in to the flesh, to drink, to debauchery, then your repentance, when it comes, is earned. It's powerful. You have to fall in order to truly rise.
That sounds like the most convenient theological excuse for bad behavior I have ever heard. I'm not getting drunk and partying. I'm preparing for a really intense prayer session later.
It is the ultimate spiritual loophole, isn't it? Now, we have to be extremely careful here. The historical record shows no definitive proof that Rasputin was ever a formally sworn member of the Kleisti. The Okhrana, the secret police, they tried to prove it for years, and they never found the smoking gun.
He certainly adopted their branding, their style.
He absolutely adopted the aesthetic. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that this specific contradiction, the sinner who is also a saint, was magnetic to the Russian soul.
Why? Why did people find that more appealing than a straightforward good monk?
Because it made him accessible. This is what our notes call the analytical twist. If Rasputin had presented himself as a perfect ascetic monk, speaking in formal high church Slavonic, he would have been intimidating, distant.
He would have felt judgmental.
Exactly, a living statue. But because he was flawed, because he openly wrestled with his appetites, because he admitted to his sins, he felt human.
He felt like them.
To the peasantry, and later even to the aristocracy, he was a man who understood how hard life was. He knew what it was to be hungry, to feel lust, to get drunk and feel ashamed the next day. He wasn't preaching down from some golden pulpit. He was sitting at their kitchen table and saying, I'm a sinner, just like you. But God's grace is big enough for us both. Let's find him in the mud together.
That is such a powerful distinction. It's the difference between a doctor lecturing you about the importance of a healthy diet and a friend who survived the same heart attack holding your hand and telling you it's going to be okay.
Precisely. And that friendship dynamic, that feeling of shared struggle, it allowed him to bypass all the traditional gatekeepers of faith. He wasn't representing the church as an institution. He was representing the raw, messy spiritual life of the people.
But this persona, this holy sinner act, it didn't just happen in a vacuum, did it? We need to talk about the stage he was stepping onto. Because a figure like Rasputin doesn't rise unless society has, in a way, created a job opening for him.
You're absolutely right. We have to zoom out and look at the broader Russian context at the turn of the 20th century. The empire was, well, it was rotting from the inside out.
The sources constantly refer to a great divide.
It was more like two different planets occupying the same borders. On one side, you have the world of St. Petersburg and Moscow, the aristocracy.
Right.
These are people who often spoke French better than they spoke Russian. They read the latest scientific journals from Paris and Berlin. They wore the latest European fashions. They were fabulously wealthy, and underneath it all, deeply, deeply bored.
And on the other side of this divide,
The peasantry, 80% of the population, functionally living in the Middle Ages, illiterate, deeply superstitious, and desperate. For them, life hadn't changed much in 500 years.
and Rasputin somehow manages to build a bridge across this massive chasm.
He becomes the conduit between these two worlds. But to understand why the rich, educated aristocrats wanted him, you first have to understand their own peculiar spiritual crisis. The Russian aristocracy was going through a massive, empire-wide obsession with the occult.
Theosophy, spiritualism, seances.
It was a full-blown craze. You have to picture these grand duchesses and government ministers and wealthy princes sitting in their lavish, dark parlors, holding hands around a table, trying to contact spirits of the dead. They were desperate for a direct, unmediated line to the supernatural.
But why? They had the official church. The Tsar himself was the divinely appointed head of the church. It was everywhere.
But the church had become a bureaucracy. For them, it felt like just another department of the government. It was formal, it was cold, it was safe. And the aristocracy didn't want safe. They wanted a thrill. They wanted what you might call rough trade spirituality.
You wanted something that felt authentic, something real.
And what could possibly feel more real to a bored French-speaking aristocrat than a dirty, intense, charismatic peasant straight out of the Siberian wilderness? He smelled like the earth. He looked like a prophet from the Old Testament. He was the real Russia that they read about in novels but never actually touched. He was an experience.
So they were already primed for him. They had basically left the door to the palace unlocked and put out a welcome mat.
They were practically begging for someone like him to walk through it. Rasputin didn't have to break into the system. He just had to show up and play the part they had already written for him.
So let's talk about how he learned to play that part. Because he didn't just emerge from Siberia as this fully formed charismatic superstar. The sources point to a distinct transformation in his life.
They do. They often call it his awakening. It seems to happen in his late 20s or early 30s. The records from his village are ambiguous, which is part of the mystique. Some accounts say he saw a vision of the Virgin Mary while working in the fields.
And the other theory?
The other, more cynical theory is that he committed a crime, possibly horse theft, which was a serious offense, and he fled the village to avoid punishment, adopting the guise of a holy man as a cover.
So it's either a divine vision or a criminal charge. Guilt or trauma seems to be the trigger, either way.
Whatever the catalyst was, the action is the same. He leaves his wife, his children, his farm, he hits the road, and he spends the next several years as a Stranik.
This is what you called his University of the Road.
It truly was. He reportedly walked thousands upon thousands of miles. He went to the great monasteries of Kiev. He went to Mount Athos in Greece, the center of Orthodox monasticism. Some accounts even say he walked all the way to Jerusalem.
And this is where he gets his real education.
Yes. Not in theology from books, but in the practical craft of spirituality.
Yeah.
He learned by watching, by listening.
What specifically was he learning on these travels?
He was perfecting his technique. Our notes refer to it as mirroring, and it's a profound psychological skill.
It sounds like something out of a modern therapy manual.
It basically is. When Rasputin would meet someone, especially someone in distress, he didn't immediately start preaching at them. His first step was always deep listening. He would just sit, maybe hold their hand, and stare intently into their eyes, and he would let them talk until they had nothing left to say.
Which, for almost anyone at that time, but especially a peasant woman or a stressed-out merchant, that was probably an incredibly rare experience. To be truly, fully listened to by a man.
It creates an immediate and incredibly powerful bond of trust. And only then, once they felt heard, would he speak. And when he spoke, he would mirror their own beliefs and desires back to them. He almost never gave concrete, specific answers. He spoke in riddles, in simple parables, in folk sayings.
He was like a human Rorschach test.
That is the perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Exactly. He would say something vague and profound sounding, like, "The little mother's heart knows its own path when the winter wind blows from the east."
Which means absolutely nothing on its own.
It means nothing, and therefore it can mean everything. If you're a young woman secretly wanting permission to have an affair, you hear, "Follow your heart." If you're a farmer trying to decide when to sell your grain, you hear, "Wait for the right moment." The listener does all the work. They fill in the blank with their own needs.
And then they walk away thinking he is the genius who solved their problem.
He knew exactly what I needed to hear.
Yeah.
No, he didn't. You did. He just provided a mirror and gave you permission to acknowledge what you already wanted.
That is a masterclass in what magicians call cold reading.
It is. And he combined this mirroring technique with an aura of absolute unshakable confidence. He never hesitated. He never sounded unsure. In a world drowning in uncertainty, that kind of confidence is a currency all its own.
This leads us directly to the idea of his healing, because the cryptic riddles and the intense staring are one thing, but he really built his reputation on getting results.
Yes, as he traveled, he became known as a healer. The stories started to precede him, trailing him from village to village like a wake. He healed a farmer's cow. He calmed a hysterical woman. He healed a sick child. He drove a demon out of a barn.
Okay, now, we need to be very forensic and careful here. The source material is adamant on this point. There is absolutely no credible evidence of what we would call medical miracles. He was not reattaching limbs or curing late-stage cancer.
Not at all. But here we have to draw a sharp distinction between curing a disease and healing a person. Rasputin was an absolute master of the placebo effect.
Let's unpack that term, because placebo can sound like you're saying it was fake, but the placebo effect is a very real physiological response.
It is one of the most powerful and mysterious forces in medicine. And let's look at the specific condition that would eventually make him famous.
Yeah.
Hemophilia. The Tsar's young son, the heir Alexei, had hemophilia. His blood wouldn't clot properly.
It's a terrifying disease. A simple fall, a nosebleed, could be a life-threatening event.
And crucially, the bleeding is made much, much worse by stress and panic. If you're terrified, your heart rate spikes, your blood pressure shoots up.
Which literally pumps the blood out of your body faster.
It does. It makes the bleeding worse. And the high pressure can prevent the body's weak clotting mechanisms from taking hold. Now, try to imagine this scene in the palace. The little boy is bleeding. His mother, the Tsarina Alexandra, is hysterical. She is screaming, crying, praying, transmitting her absolute terror to the child. The royal doctors are bustling around, prodding him, adding to the chaos and the stress.
It's a feedback loop of panic.
A death spiral of panic. And then Rasputin walks into the room. And what does he do? He doesn't panic. He's the calm at the center of the storm. He is heavy. He is slow. And he says, with absolute soul-deep authority, "Don't worry. The boy will live. Send the doctors away. Let him rest."
He takes control of the emotional environment.
He completely lowers the temperature in the room. The mother, the Tsarina, calms down because this holy man has told her it's going to be okay. The child sees his mother calm down, so he begins to calm down. His heart rate drops. His blood pressure drops.
And as a result, the bleeding slows down.
The bleeding slows, and the body's natural clotting can finally take over. It's not magic. It is psychosomatic regulation. But for that desperate mother, standing there watching the bleeding stop when the best doctors in the empire could do nothing, that is a miracle.
And she would do anything for the man who performed that miracle.
She would hand him the keys to the empire. And she did.
It just really emphasizes that healing in this context is about the patient's holistic experience, not just the isolated biological mechanism. He treated the fear and the body followed.
He was a kind of soul surgeon, as one source put it. He went into the situation and he surgically excised the panic.
I want to touch on one more element of his toolkit before we wrap up and look at the myth building. The presence.
Ah, yes. The eyes.
Everyone mentions the eyes. Even his most bitter enemies. Even the men who eventually murdered him wrote in their diaries about his eyes. They used words like pale, piercing, phosphorescent.
It's a very consistent, very physical description, and it speaks to how he used his own body as a tool, or even as a weapon.
What do you mean a weapon?
Well, in that very formal, repressed Victorian and Edwardian society, personal space was very strictly codified. You kept your distance from people, you didn't make prolonged, intense eye contact. Rasputin violated all of those rules.
How so?
He would walk right up to you, far closer than was considered polite. He would grab your hands, he would lean in until you could smell the tobacco and booze on his breath, and he would stare.
That's incredibly aggressive behavior.
It's a classic primate dominance behavior. In biology, a fixed, unblinking stare is a threat. It triggers a primal fight-or-flight response in the other person, an adrenaline spike. You feel hunted.
So when he was staring at these refined aristocrats, he was basically destabilizing them on a biological level.
He was hacking their nervous system. He made them feel something powerful and intense. And because they were meeting him in a spiritual context, they misinterpreted that physiological jolt of fear or arousal as holiness.
So instead of thinking, this strange man is being very rude, invading my personal space,
They thought, he is seeing into my soul.
I feel shaken to my core, therefore he must be a powerful holy man.
Exactly. It's a brilliant psychological reframe.
Okay, so let's put the pieces together. We have the man from nowhere profile, forged in the Siberian pressure cooker. We have the not a monk branding, which made him accessible. We have the mirroring technique. We have the placebo healing. And we have this overpowering physical dominance.
That is the complete toolkit. And as he traveled west across Russia, roughly between 1903 and 1905, the myth began to accumulate around him.
This wasn't an overnight sensation.
No, it was a slow burn. The stories would move ahead of him, pass from village to village by word of mouth. A holy man is coming. They say he can see the future. He wears heavy chains under his robes to repent for his sins. By the time he actually arrived in a town, the audience was already prepped. They were ready to believe.
They wanted him to be real.
That is the absolute key to this entire story. The desire for a savior is always, always more powerful than the savior himself. Russia was a desperate place at that moment. The poor were starving. The rich were terrified of the growing revolutionary movements. Everybody from top to bottom was looking for a way out of the mess.
They were looking for certainty in an uncertain world.
And Grigory Rasputin sold certainty. He was an entrepreneur of hope. In a society suffering a market crash of faith, he was the only one still buying.
And that trajectory, that westward movement of his reputation, was carrying him toward the one place in the entire empire where that certainty was needed most desperately.
St. Petersburg.
The Winter Palace, the imperial family.
The collision point. When the man from nowhere finally meets the family with everything, the chemical reaction is explosive.
So, to summarize part one of our investigation, what we found is that Rasputin wasn't born a demon. He certainly wasn't a wizard.
He was a survivor. A man of almost preternatural emotional intelligence who learned how to survive in one of the harshest physical environments on Earth, and then instinctively applied those same survival skills to the highest, most treacherous levels of power.
He had an incredible gift for figuring out what people needed, whether that was forgiveness for their sins or hope for a sick child or just the feeling of being truly seen, and he gave it to them.
But the tragedy, which we'll see in part two, is that he didn't know when to stop. Or maybe he couldn't. He rode the wave of his own myth until it inevitably crashed on the rocks.
I think the idea of the lazy storytelling trap is the most important thing to take away from this part of the story. It is so easy to just dismiss him as a common fraud. But a simple fraud would have been caught.
A simple fraud doesn't last 10 weeks in the snake pit of the Russian court, let alone 10 years. He was offering them something real. It wasn't divine magic, but the psychological effect was absolutely real.
Which brings us to our final insight for today. That in the end, Rasputin is a mirror. He reflects the anxieties and the desperation of his time. The monster, the mad monk, is just a projection of a society that was itself going mad.
We create our own monsters. And more often than not, we create them because we need them to explain things we can't otherwise understand.
Right. We needed him to be a singular, demonic monster so that we didn't have to look at the deeply sick and broken political and social system that created him in the first place.
Exactly. He becomes the scapegoat for a dying empire.
So we have set the stage. The actor is now in place. The audience in the palace is waiting.
And the tragedy is about to begin?
Next time, in part 2 of our deep dive, we're going to look at what happens when this man and his methods collide with imperial politics. We're going to look at the First World War, and we're going to examine his murder not as a sensational ghost story, but as a calculated political assassination.
That is the moment when the mystic becomes a national threat, and that is when the bullets finally come out.
We hope you'll join us then for the conclusion of our investigation into the real Rasputin.
It only gets darker from here.
You know, when we think about power, like real empire-shaking power, we tend to imagine something loud.
Yeah, that's the traditional view, for
Yeah.
sure. You picture armies, generals barking orders.
Exactly. Trumpets, thrones, a czar with a scepter, power that announces itself.
But that's not what we're talking about today.
Not at all. We are deep diving into a kind of power that arrives quietly. It doesn't kick down the door. It sort of slips in through the back. It's not about authority, it's about access.
Access versus authority. That's the whole ball game right there. And that brings us back to part 2 of our series on Grigory Rasputin.
Right. In part 1, we covered his origins, the wandering mystic. But today, the mission is different. We need to unpack how this one man with no rank, no title, no qualifications,
And then,
how he becomes an existential threat to the entire Russian state.
and what's so fascinating, the source material, the court memoirs, the medical records from that time, is that Rasputin himself doesn't really change. He's still that same weird religious guy.
It's his location that changes.
His location changes completely. He moves from the edge of the world right into the bullseye.
So let's set the scene. Early 20th century Russia. From the outside, the imperial court looks invulnerable. Fabergé eggs, grand balls.
Gold leaf on everything. But inside, if you read the diaries, the feeling isn't celebration. It's just fear.
It's a house of cards.
It really is. Tsar Nicholas II is ruling an empire that's cracking at the seams. You've got the 1905 revolution in the rearview mirror, massive inequality, political unrest just bubbling away.
But the thing that really stood out to me from the reading is that the biggest threat, the thing keeping the Tsar and Tsarina up at night, it wasn't the revolutionaries.
Not yet, no. The biggest threat was personal. It was already inside the palace.
And this is it. This is the secret that ruled everything.
It is. You cannot understand Rasputin without understanding the medical crisis with the heir, Tsarevich Alexei, the only son. He had hemophilia.
And we hear hemophilia today and think, okay, it's a manageable condition. But back then,
It was a horror movie. It was basically a death sentence. Hemophilia means the blood doesn't clot. So a simple fall, a bruise on the knee, it meant weeks of agony. Internal bleeding, joints swelling up, putting this incredible pressure on the nerves.
the descriptions are just heartbreaking. The poor kid would be screaming, begging to die, and his parents, the most powerful people in Russia, could do nothing.
Yeah, this isn't just a family tragedy. For a dynasty that needs a male heir, it is a full-blown state security crisis.
Right. If the public found out their future ruler could die from a nosebleed, the monarchy's legitimacy would just collapse.
They couldn't afford to show that weakness, so they hid it. It becomes this massive state secret.
So behind the scenes, Empress Alexandra is just a wreck. She's desperate. And desperation.
Well, it makes you open doors you'd normally keep bolted shut.
Precisely. And that is Rasputin's entry point. He doesn't show up as a political player. He's brought in through religious connections because he's offering the one thing they can't buy.
He offers hope. And the contrast is amazing, isn't it? You have the Romanovs, paralyzed by fear and anxiety.
And in walks Rasputin. Calm, confident. He's not impressed by the palace. He's not afraid of the Tsar.
That confidence is everything. When Alexei would have one of these terrible bleeding episodes, the doctors were helpless, so they would summon Rasputin.
Which brings us to the miracle. This is where the story usually gets sensationalized, you know? Rasputin the wizard.
Right. He walks in, says a prayer, and the bleeding stops. For a long time, people just wrote it off as a coincidence or something supernatural.
But the medical notes from the time tell a very different story. This was my big aha moment.
It wasn't magic. It was kind of accidental science.
Okay, so let's break this down. What were the best doctors in Russia actually doing to the boy?
Well, early 20th century medicine wasn't exactly gentle. They were prating him, poking him, using all sorts of invasive treatments. All of that just creates immense stress,
And stress raises blood pressure.
which makes clotting even harder. So the cure is actually making the disease worse. But there's another layer.
The medication.
Yes. This is crucial. One of the new wonder drugs for pain at the time was aspirin.
Which we now know is an anticoagulant.
We know it thins the blood. It stops clotting. So these doctors, with the bad intentions, are pumping the poor kid full of a drug that is chemically preventing the bleeding from stopping.
That is just a tragic, tragic irony.
It's awful.
Ah.
And then Rasputin walks in, and what does he do?
He kicks the doctors out.
He throws them out. He says, don't bother the child. He sits by the bed, he prays, he calms the entire room down.
So by getting rid of the doctors, he gets rid of the aspirin, he gets rid of the stress.
And the bleeding stops naturally. The body finally has a chance to do its work.
But Alexandra doesn't know about anticoagulants or blood pressure.
No. All she sees is this. The men of science failed. The man of God succeeded. The result is all that matters to her.
She doesn't just see him as a healer. She sees him as essential, sent by God.
Exactly. And this, right here, is the pivot. This is the moment Rasputin becomes dangerous. Not because he grabs for power.
But because she hands it to him. It's a psychological transfer.
Total trust. If you trust someone with the life of your child, the most important thing in the world, you start to trust them with other things too.
It's a slippery slope. If God speaks through him about Alexei's health,
Then maybe God speaks through him about who should be a minister.
or who should lead an army.
And that is exactly what happened. His influence it bled out from the nursery into state affairs. But he never had an official title.
The access without authority. I was reading about the cross notes.
Oh, the famous notes. He'd scribble on these greasy scraps of paper.
In this awful handwriting, do this for my friend, and he'd just sign it Grigori.
And imagine you're some high-ranking aristocratic minister who's worked his whole life to get where he is. You get this crumpled note from a peasant telling you who to hire.
You'd be furious.
Infuriated. But they knew if they ignored it, Rasputin would go to Alexandra, and Alexander would go to the Tsar, and
You're out of a job.
you're out. So the entire chain of command is broken. It's structural chaos.
And you can fire a minister. How do you fire a friend?
You can't. There's
No.
no process. And the Russian nobility, the elites who play by all the rules, they were just losing their minds.
It was a class thing, too, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely visceral. They were humiliated. This peasant, who they saw as crude and unwashed, was walking right into the inner sanctum.
Crashing the ultimate gate. I read there'd be lines of people outside his apartment generals, society ladies, all waiting for an audience with him.
He became a shortcut to power. And he had no respect for their hierarchy. He called the Tsar and Tsarina Papa and Mama.
Which, to a system built on mystique, is terrifying.
It shatters the illusion. So they had to react, but they couldn't attack his result.
Right, because Alexei is alive. He's walking around. You can't say the healing isn't working.
So since they couldn't attack the results, they attacked the man, they weaponized rumor. And to be fair, Rasputin gave them a lot of material to work with.
He really did. Which brings us to the Yar restaurant incident. That feels like a real turning point for his public image.
It's one of the most famous examples, yeah.
Yeah.
He supposedly gets drunk at this fancy Moscow restaurant, starts shouting that he has the Empress in the palm of his hand, implies a sexual relationship.
I mean, that's treason. You can't say that.
It's nuclear.
Yeah.
The police report was sent straight to the Tsar. Everyone thought, okay, this is it. He's finally done for.
But he wasn't?
He wasn't. Because when Nicholas confronted Alexandra with the report, she refused to believe it. She said it was a fabrication. Saints, she said, are always slandered.
That denial is powerful. But for the rest of Russia, who doesn't know about the hemophilia, how's this look?
It looks like the whole monarchy is rotten from the inside out. The rumors just explode. That he's a German spy, that he and the Empress are lovers.
The truth becomes completely secondary to perception.
Totally. He stops being a man and becomes a symbol.
A symbol of decay.
The poster boy for everything wrong with Russia. Military fails. It's Rasputin's fault. Food shortages. Rasputin. He became a projection screen for all the country's fears.
And this gets so much worse when World War I starts. I was reading about the ministerial leapfrog.
Oh, it was chaos. Nicholas goes to the front, leaving Alexandra in charge. And that basically means leaving Rasputin in charge of Alexandra.
And they just started firing everyone.
I mean, in a short period during World War, they went through 4 prime ministers, multiple ministers of war. It was catastrophic.
So anyone who stood up to Rasputin was fired.
And anyone who flattered him was promoted. Competence was irrelevant. Loyalty to our friend was the only thing that mattered.
Which brings up the big question, why? Why didn't the Tsar just get rid of him? He's the autocrat. He can do whatever he wants.
Because he was trapped. People tried to warn him. His own ministers, his family, even the church condemned Rasputin.
That he stayed.
He stayed. Because to remove Rasputin, Nicholas had to convince Alexandra that their son would be safe without him. And she would never, ever believe that.
It all comes back to the secret, to Alexei.
For her, the logic was absolute. If Rasputin goes, Alexei dies. You can't fight that with political arguments. That's the mother's logic.
So the Tsar's paralyzed. Keeping Rasputin is destroying his empire, but firing him might destroy his family.
It's a complete deadlock.
Uh-huh.
And as the war gets worse and millions of Russians are dying, the system needs a scapegoat. And Rasputin is standing right there, next to the throne, but outside the system.
The perfect target.
Untouchable by the Tsar, but hated by literally everyone else.
So to wrap this up for part 2, Rasputin wasn't dangerous because he was some evil genius with a plan.
No, not at all. He was dangerous because belief replaced institutions. Access replaced authority.
The threat wasn't his intent, it was just his proximity.
He was a symptom of a collapsing system. He filled a void of leadership at the very top, and his influence just spread like a crack until it broke the foundation of the state.
So you have a desperate mother, a paralyzed czar, a hated mystic, and a nobility that has finally decided they've had enough.
The situation had become completely untenable, since he couldn't be fired.
He had to be removed.
The talk in the salons wasn't, how do we get him fired anymore? It was, how do we kill him?
And that sets us up perfectly for part 3. Next time, we are deep diving into the assassination. And let me tell you, the real story is crazier and messier than any movie you've ever seen.
It's a chaotic end to a chaotic life. But maybe as a final thought for today, we always look for the monsters in history, right? The villains.
It's easier to blame a demon than a systemic failure.
It is. But with Rasputin, you have to wonder, how often is the real danger just a desperate parent trying to save their child, and in doing so, they accidentally let the chaos in through the back door? Was he the monster, or just the most obvious symptom of a disease that was already terminal?
Something to think about. Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll see you next time for the finale. Welcome back to the deep dive. We are in part 3 of our series on Grigory Rasputin, and I have to say, the more we look into this, the more the myth just kind of peels away.
It really does.
Yeah.
And what's left underneath is, I think, somehow even stranger.
It's less of a wild folktale and more of a political thriller.
Exactly. A very dark one.
Okay, so just to reset for everyone, part 1, we covered who he actually was.
The peasant, the pilgrim.
Part 2, we got into his power source, the healing, that intense connection with the imperial family. But today the vibe really shifts.
It does. We're not talking about his rise anymore. We're talking about the reaction to it.
Today is about the darkness that started to gather around him.
Yeah. The sources we're looking at use this phrase that I just can't get out of my head, the architecture of hatred.
I love that, because you think of hatred as this chaotic, emotional thing.
Right, just random.
No.
But this suggests it's not.
Yeah.
It's built. It has a structure.
A blueprint.
It does. It has a foundation. And in Rasputin's case, that foundation was built on really 3 things: fear, humiliation, and a complete loss of control.
It's just wild because by 1916, he's at the absolute peak of his influence. He is arguably the most powerful man in Russia.
Behind the Tsar, yeah.
And at the exact same moment, he becomes the most hated man in the entire empire. And I want to be clear for everyone listening, we're not just talking about revolutionaries on the street.
No, that's the key thing here. If it was just them, it's just politics as usual. But this was different. He was surrounded by enemies in the highest halls of power.
We're talking grand dukes, archbishops,
Generals, prime ministers. I mean, these people sincerely believed, not just suspected, but believed in their gut, that the Russian Empire could not survive while Rasputin lived.
So our mission today is to be detectives, but for, like, social psychology. We're not here to debate if Rasputin was a good guy or a bad guy.
No, we're not judging his morality today. We're analyzing what historians call the fatal consensus.
How did all these different groups, the aristocracy, the church, the military, the press, who, let's be honest, hated each other?
Oh, they couldn't agree on anything.
How did they all arrive at the exact same conclusion?
Rasputin must go. It's a study in systemic failure, really.
Okay, let's peel it back layer by layer. I want to start at the very top. The aristocracy. The princes, the creme de la creme of St. Petersburg. Why was the hatred so visceral? Was it just jealousy?
See, I think jealousy is too simple. That would imply they saw him as an equal who was just getting ahead. This was much deeper.
It felt different.
The sources call it existential humiliation. You have to picture what the Russian nobility was. It wasn't just about money. They live in one of the most rigid hierarchies in history.
Table of ranks, right?
Exactly. Your whole life was defined by your spot on that ladder. Who your grandfather was, how you held your fork, the specific dialect of French you spoke at court.
Wait, they spoke French, not Russian.
At court, yes.
What?
It was a sign of sophistication. Their whole reality was this carefully built performance of superiority.
And into this perfumed French-speaking world walks Grigory Rasputin.
A peasant, and not a clean Hollywood peasant. He's unwashed. He smells like sweat and wood smoke. He eats with his hands. He is just aggressively out of place.
The contrast must have been jarring. Duchesses and diamonds and this guy who looks like he just walked out of a barn.
But here's the insult. The thing that broke them. He had access. They didn't.
Ah.
His presence made their entire value system meaningless. If this peasant can walk past the guards and sit with the empress, then what does your 300-year-old name even matter? What's the point of being a prince?
It just shatters the illusion.
It completely breaks the simulation.
Hmm.
But there was another layer to it, something even more primal than humiliation.
Which was?
The fear of unpredictability.
This was a fascinating point in the research, the idea that power structures can actually put up with a lot.
They can. History shows this over and over. Power structures can tolerate corruption, they can tolerate incompetence, they can even tolerate cruelty.
As long as you play by the rules.
As long as you play by the rules. The one thing a system like that cannot stand is unpredictability.
And Rasputin was chaos in human form.
He didn't know the rules, and worse, he didn't care. He'd talk to a Grand Duke like he was an old friend from Siberia. He'd contradict generals to their faces. He acted like he belonged.
And to them, that's terrifying.
It's terrifying. Systems need predictability to survive. He was a variable they just couldn't solve for.
Okay, so the nobles hate him because he makes them feel obsolete. But what about the Russian Orthodox Church? You'd think a holy man close to the Tsar would be a win for them.
You would think so.
Yeah.
But you have to see the church as like a corporation. It had a monopoly on spiritual authority in Russia.
It's a supply chain for grace.
That's a perfect way to put it. And Rasputin is bypassing the middleman.
He's a freelancer.
He's a freelancer. He has no official rank, no bishop to answer to. He's doing healings and giving advice without a license, basically. It challenges their exclusive right to say who's holy and who isn't.
He's a spiritual disruptor.
He is. And then, of course, you have the rumors, the drunkenness, the sexual stuff.
We talked about how much of that was true in the last deep dive. But for the church, did the truth even matter?
Not really. For them, the damage was done by the association. Remember, the church and state were one. The Tsar is the head of the church.
So if the Tsar's spiritual advisor is seen drunk in a tavern,
it damages the whole brand. It makes faith look chaotic and personal, not institutional and controlled. He was making a mockery of their cloth.
All right. Nobles feel humiliated. Church feels undermined. Let's get to the people trying to run the country, the politicians, the ministers. Their problem seems a bit more practical.
It was, but it was also just drenched in paranoia.
Yeah.
For them, it was all about the invisible influence.
The puppet master idea.
Exactly. There was this period called ministerial leapfrog because ministers were getting hired and fired so fast.
And they all thought Rasputin was the one pushing the buttons.
They were convinced of it, convinced he was whispering in the empress's ear, getting people he didn't like fired.
But was he actually doing that? I mean, really dictating policy?
The evidence is surprisingly thin. Did he have influence? Absolutely. Was he a shadow emperor? Probably not. But, and this is so important, in that world, perception is everything.
If you believe your career depends on some mystic liking you, the result is the same.
Exactly. Trust in the government just collapsed. They felt like they couldn't do their jobs because of this dark force behind the throne.
And all of this is happening with World War I raging in the background.
And it is going catastrophically for Russia. Millions dead, soldiers without rifles, without boots. It's a national trauma.
And in a trauma like that, you need someone to blame.
You need a face for the failure. And Rasputin was the perfect target. He had opposed the war from the start. So when things went bad, the story flipped.
He's not just a bad advisor, he's a traitor.
First unpatriotic, then a traitor, and finally a German agent.
That was the big one, right? That he and the Empress, who was German, were spies.
It was the conspiracy theory of the century. People truly believed he was sending military secrets to the Germans.
Any truth to it?
None. Zero. The evidence just isn't there. But the military leadership needed a reason for why they were losing. It couldn't be their fault. It had to be sabotage.
It's the classic scapegoat. He absorbs all the failure.
He became the lightning rod for everything. The shells are wrong. Rasputin. The bread doesn't arrive. Rasputin.
And pouring gasoline on all of this is the press.
Oh, the press accelerated everything. By 1916, Rasputin wasn't a person anymore. He was a caricature. He was a headline.
The cartoons are grotesque.
They're visceral. They made him a monster, a huge, looming sexual predator with the tiny Tsar and Empress in his hands like puppets.
It's pure dehumanization.
And that's the psychological trick.
Right.
Once you turn a man into a monster, you're not killing a man anymore.
You're slaying a dragon.
And this leads to this conspiracy mindset. He became the answer for everything. Political failure, Rasputin. Military defeat, Rasputin, moral decay.
Rasputin, it's so convenient.
It's incredibly convenient. When a complex system fails, we crave a simple cause, a single thing we can remove to fix it all.
And that's where the fatal consensus really locks in.
All these groups who disagreed on everything else, the liberals, the conservatives, the church, they found the one thing they could all agree on.
Rasputin is the problem.
And if you remove the problem, the system will heal itself.
This brings us to the most chilling part of this for me. The justification. The people who killed him didn't think they were murderers.
No, absolutely not. And this is the key. They saw themselves as patriots, as saviors.
The source uses that medical metaphor, surgery.
Yes, they truly believed Russia was a dying patient and Rasputin was the cancer. They weren't committing a crime. They were surgeons, cutting out the infection to save the body.
That logic is terrifying because it makes murder a moral duty.
It makes an extreme act feel not just necessary, but noble. Felix Yusupov, one of the killers, wrote about it later with this feeling of holy purpose, like he was doing God's work.
And here's the ultimate tragic irony of it all. They were wrong.
Completely devastatingly wrong.
They cut out the cancer.
And the patient still died. They killed him. And the next day, nothing changed. The war was still being lost. The people were still starving.
If anything, it made it worse, right?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
Because their excuse was gone. The dark force was dead. So people looked at the Tsar and said, okay, the evil monk is gone. Why are things still terrible?
You can't blame the scapegoat when the scapegoat's in the river.
Exactly. When you remove the scapegoat and the house is still on fire, you have to face the fact that the problem is in the foundation.
That's such a powerful takeaway. He wasn't hated because he was uniquely evil. He was hated because he was a uniquely simple explanation for a world that was collapsing.
He was a symptom, not the disease. And you can't cure the disease just by killing the symptom.
It just shows how societies in crisis look for that easy fix, that one person to blame.
The surgery. But the world is rarely that simple. And that need for a simple answer usually just leads to more tragedy.
Well, the stage is set, the hatred is at a boil, the surgery is scheduled. Next time, in our final part, we are going into the Moika Palace. We are going to separate the wild legend of his murder from what the evidence actually says.
It's going to be a long, strange night.
You won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
See you next time.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we are doing something a little bit different. Usually, we take a stack of articles and books and we try to build a picture of what happened. But today, we are effectively walking onto a crime scene.
A very cold, very old crime scene.
Freezing, literally. We're traveling back to St. Petersburg, December 1916. We are finally tackling the moment that I think most people have been waiting for since we started this series on Rasputin.
I think so.
We are talking about the night he died, or I guess I should say the night he finally died.
Finally is the operative word there. That word finally does a lot of heavy lifting in the history books.
It really, really does. Because this isn't just a murder case. This is like the legend of all legends.
Oh, absolutely.
If you stop the average person on the street, someone who hasn't read the biographies, someone who just knows the pop culture, and you say Rasputin, what do they say?
They don't say Siberian mystic with complex theological views.
No, they don't talk about his theology. They don't talk about the peasant reforms. They talk about the cyanide, the gunshots, the drowning.
And the disco song. Can't forget the disco song.
Rah, rah, Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen.
It's kitschy, but it's historically, flexible.
Exactly. It's this comic book version of history. He eats poison like it's candy. He takes bullets like Superman. He only dies when the freezing Never River finally claims him. It's so cinematic. It's perfect. It feels like a script written by a horror movie director.
And that is exactly why we need to be suspicious.
Because life isn't a movie.
Because history is usually messy. It's confusing, it's inconsistent, and frankly, it's often disappointing.
Yeah.
When a historical narrative is that clean monster versus heroes, supernatural versus science, good versus evil, it usually means someone has been polishing the rough edges.
Right. Someone's been editing the story.
So, our mission today is to do something that might feel a little uncomfortable for listeners who, love the spooky side of this story. We are going to strip away the legend.
We're killing the vibe to find the truth.
In a way, yes. We are going to conduct a forensic audit of one of the most famous assassinations of the 20th century. We are looking at versions versus facts.
I like that.
We need to peel back the layers of the story told by Prince Yusupov and compare it to the autopsy reports, the ballistics, the medical science, and the political reality.
And spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert, the reality is much grittier, much clumsier, and frankly much darker than the legend.
Okay, I'm ready to be disillusioned. Let's set the stage first. It is December 1916. The First World War has been grinding Russia into dust for 2 years.
A catastrophic war.
Millions are dead. The economy is in free fall. And in the palaces of St. Petersburg, the atmosphere is just toxic.
Yeah.
A group of men decides that Grigory Rasputin has to die.
Right.
Now, who are these guys? I feel like when we say conspirators, we picture shadowy assassins or, anarchists in a dark basement with a bomb.
And that is the first massive misconception we have to throw out.
Yeah.
These weren't Bolsheviks making bombs in a cellar.
Not at all.
These weren't desperate revolutionaries.
Yeah.
These men were the absolute elite, the 1% of the 1%.
The establishment.
The definition of the establishment. Let's look at the roster because the demographics here are crucial to understanding the why behind it all.
Okay.
First, you have the ringleader, Prince Felix Yusupov.
I've seen pictures of him. He doesn't look like a killer. He looks like a movie star from the silent film era.
He was incredibly beautiful in a very specific aesthetic way.
Yeah.
And he was arguably the wealthiest man in Russia.
Wealthier than the Tsar.
Some historians estimate the Yusupov family fortune was actually larger than the Tsar's personal wealth.
Yeah.
He owned wines, factories, dozens of palaces, estates all across the country. He was Oxford educated. He ran in the highest social circles in London and Paris. He was known for cross-dressing in cabarets. He was the ultimate golden boy of the era.
So he has everything to lose. This isn't some desperate act.
Everything. He is the system. Then you have Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich.
Okay, the name gives it away. He's royalty.
He's the Tsar's first cousin. He's a favorite of the imperial family, a dashing young officer, an Olympic equestrian. He is pure Romanov blood.
Right.
And then, providing the political muscle, you have Vladimir Purishkevich,
The loud one, we've talked about him before.
the very loud one. He was a right-wing, ultra-monarchist politician in the Duma, famous for these fire and brimstone speeches. Just weeks before the murder, he stood up in Parliament and basically screamed that the Tsar's ministers had been turned into marionettes, with Rasputin pulling the strings.
So you have a prince, a royal duke, and a right-wing politician. It sounds like the setup for a joke, but these are the guys holding the guns.
It's an extraordinary group.
Why get their hands dirty? They could have hired someone easily, paid some thug to do it.
And that is the key question. Why do it themselves? It really comes down to their mindset. By December 1916, the aristocracy was in a state of absolute hysteria. And I use that word deliberately.
It was a panic.
A total moral panic. They convinced themselves that Rasputin wasn't just a bad advisor. They believed he was the source of all evil in Russia. They thought he was a German spy. They thought he was sleeping with the Empress. They thought he was literally spiritually destroying the Romanov dynasty.
So in their heads, this wasn't murder. This was
What?
an intervention.
A surgical procedure.
Yeah.
An act of patriotism. They genuinely believed that if they cut out the cancer Rasputin, the fever would break.
The body politic would heal itself.
Exactly. The Tsar would wake up from his trance, the war effort would turn around, and the monarchy would be saved. They didn't see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as saviors.
Which is such a dangerous mindset. I am so right and my cause is so just that the laws of God and man just don't apply to me.
Especially when you are a Grand Duke and the laws barely apply to you anyway. But this status is so important because it explains how the story was told later.
Oh.
These men had reputations to uphold. They couldn't just say, we jumped a guy in a basement and shot him. They had to frame it as a noble, epic battle.
Right, it had to be mythic. Okay, keep that image in mind, everyone. The wealthy elite trying to be heroes. Now let's get to the night in question. December 16th, roughly midnight. The official story.
Legend.
Where does this specific narrative come from? The cakes, the prayer, the struggle. Who told us this?
It comes almost exclusively from one man, Prince Felix Yusupov.
The ringleader himself.
Years later, while living in exile in Paris, he wrote a memoir. And he details this night with incredible novelistic flair. He frames it almost like a Gothic horror novel.
He is the screenwriter of his own crime.
Precisely. So let's walk through the Yusupov cut of the movie. According to him, the plan is set. He invites Rasputin to his palace on the Moika River.
And the bait was his wife, right? Princess Irina. She was supposed to be there.
Yes, Rasputin had a fascination with her. She was considered one of the most beautiful women in Russia, a niece of the Tsar. Yusupov told Rasputin that Irina would be there and wanted to meet him.
Was she?
No, not even close. She was in Crimea. She wanted nothing to do with it.
So the entire premise of the night is a lie from the very beginning.
A complete fabrication. Rasputin arrives, expecting a late-night rendezvous with the princess. Instead, Yusupov leads him down a spiral staircase into a basement dining room.
A soundproof basement, I've read.
Yes, Yusupov is very specific about this. He had the room renovated just for the murder. Soundproofed walls, heavy rugs, antique furniture to make it look cozy and inviting. And on the table,
Let me guess.
bottles of expensive Madeira wine and a plate of petit four cakes with pink and chocolate icing.
Laced with potassium cyanide?
Enough to kill a platoon of soldiers, according to Yusupov's account. And this is where the tension builds in his story. Rasputin comes in. He's a little suspicious. But Yusupov charms him, puts him at ease. Rasputin starts eating the cakes.
I can just picture it. Yusupov watching him, heart pounding, just waiting for him to drop.
Yusupov is terrified. He's watching this mad monk devour what he believes is pure poison. Rasputin eats one cake. Nothing. Eats another. Still nothing. He drinks the poisoned wine, and he's still just sitting there, maybe complaining about the wine being too sweet.
That is the moment where the music stops in the movie. That can't be happening.
All right. Yusupov describes his own escalating panic. He thinks, is this man a demon? Is he immortal? Rasputin actually asks Yusupov to play the guitar for him.
You're kidding.
No. So you have this surreal, almost psychedelic scene. The killer is playing cheerful gypsy songs on a guitar, sweating bullets, while the victim sits there, full of what should be lethal cyanide, humming along and looking perfectly fine.
That creates such a specific image of Rasputin that he is beyond human frailty, that normal rules don't apply to him.
Exactly. It's the central pillar of the legend. So hours pass. Yusupov can't take it anymore. He excuses himself, goes upstairs, confers with the other conspirators who are waiting there, grabs a revolver, comes back down,
And shoots him.
shoots Rasputin in the chest. Rasputin lets out a roar, clutches his heart, and falls onto a white bearskin rug.
And they celebrate. They think it's over.
They do. They pop the champagne. They think the nation is saved. But then, and this is the classic horror trope, Yusupov gets a nagging feeling. He goes back to check the body.
Oh, no.
He leans in close. And suddenly Rasputin's eyes snap open.
The jump scare.
The ultimate jump scare. Yusupov writes the eyes were green and snake-like. Rasputin grabs him by the throat, rips an epaulette off his uniform, and growls, "Felix, Felix."
I mean, that's pure movie making right there.
And then this man who has been poisoned and shot through the heart scrambles to his feet on all fours like an animal and runs up the stairs to the courtyard.
The zombie monk.
Now,
Don't stay dead.
Purishkevich hears the commotion and runs out into the snow. He fires, misses, fires, misses again. Then he bites his hand to steady his aim, fires a third time, and hits Rasputin in the back.
And he falls.
He falls. Purishkevich runs up and, for good measure, shoots him in the head. They beat him with a rubber truncheon. And finally, they wrap him in a curtain, drive him to a bridge, and dump him in the river.
And the cherry on top of this whole legend, when they find the body a few days later, his arms are raised and there was water in his lungs, proving he was still alive under the ice, trying to claw his way out.
That is the legend. It paints Rasputin as this supernatural force that required earth, fire, and water, and poison and bullets to finally destroy an elemental evil.
Okay, it is a great story. It really is. I can see why it sells books and inspires songs, but you are here to tell me it is, well, mostly garbage.
It is folklore. And like all folklore, it serves a purpose. But if we want the truth, we have to put on our lab coats. We need to dismantle this piece by piece, starting with the poison.
Right, the cyanide. I have heard so many theories over the years about why it didn't work. I've had the sugar in the cakes neutralized it. I've heard Rasputin had some kind of alcoholic gastritis that prevented absorption.
Popular one.
And I've even heard that he practiced taking small doses of poison to build up immunity, like in The Princess Bride.
Okay, we need to stop right there and look at the actual chemistry and biology. Potassium cyanide is not a slow, subtle poison. It's not something you can build a tolerance to.
So it's not like alcohol.
Not at all. It is a metabolic asphyxiant.
Yeah.
It works by binding to an enzyme called cytochrome C oxidase in your mitochondria.
Okay, translate that for me. What does that actually do to a person?
Basically, it stops your cells from being able to use oxygen. You can be in a room full of fresh air, breathing perfectly, but your cells are suffocating on a molecular level. And it is incredibly fast.
How fast?
Seconds to minutes. If you ingest a lethal dose, or even a significant sublethal dose, you don't just sit there humming along to a guitar. You have violent convulsions. You foam at the mouth. You lose control of your bowels. Your skin might turn cherry red. Your heart stops. It's a horrific, dramatic death.
So the sugar neutralized it theory.
Chemically bogus. While it's true that glucose can, under very specific laboratory conditions, bind with cyanide to form a less toxic compound, that reaction takes hours, high heat, and specific pH levels. It doesn't happen in 5 minutes on a pastry plate in a cold basement.
And the gastritis theory. His stomach lining was too damaged.
Also irrelevant. Cyanide doesn't need a healthy stomach lining to kill you. It just needs to get into the bloodstream, which it does very efficiently.
So if he ate the poison, he would have died. Or at the very least, he would have been on the floor screaming. He wouldn't be asking for another glass of Madeira.
Precisely. Which leaves us with two possibilities. Possibility one. Rasputin was a supernatural entity whose physiology defied the known laws of carbon-based life.
Right.
Or possibility two. There was no poison, or at least none that he actually consumed.
Occam's razor suggests number 2 is a bit more likely. But wait, what about the evidence? Didn't they confirm poison in the autopsy?
No. And this is the real smoking gun, or I should say the lack thereof. The autopsy was performed by a very competent, very high-profile professor, Dr. Dmitry Kozyrtov. We have his findings.
And what did he find?
He examined the stomach contents. He found a dark, mushy mass of digested food, some of which was probably cake and wine. He smelled it.
Smelled it. Why?
Because cyanide has a very distinct smell of bitter almonds. It's a classic forensic test. There was no smell.
Nothing.
Nothing. Then he ran chemical tests. The result, negative for cyanide.
0. Not even a trace.
0 trace.
So, Yusupov just lied. The whole poison scene was an invention. Or maybe the supplier duped them.
That's a possibility.
Huh.
There is a theory that the conspirator who was supposed to supply the poison, Dr. Lazarevert, got cold feet. He might have sworn the Hippocratic Oath and decided at the last minute he couldn't participate in a murder, so he's swapped the cyanide for aspirin or baking soda.
That's plausible.
It is. But frankly, looking at how much Yusupov embellished the rest of the story, I think it is much more likely that Yusupov invented the poison narrative entirely after the fact.
Why? That's the part I don't get. If you shot the guy, you killed him. Why add this layer that makes you look kind of incompetent, like your first plan failed?
Think about the optics. Think about the mission of the murder we talked about.
To be heroes.
Right. If Yusupov just lures an unarmed guest into his basement and shoots him, what does that make him?
A coward. A murderer who violated the sacred laws of hospitality.
Exactly. It's a squalid, dishonorable act. But if he first tries to poison him with a dose that would kill an elephant, and the man doesn't die...
Then he's not a man. He's a monster. He's something else.
Exactly. It validates everything the conspirators believed. See? We told you he was the Antichrist. We tried to kill him like gentlemen with poisoned wine, but his demonic powers were too strong. We had no choice but to use bullets. It turns a gangland hit into an exorcism.
That is fascinating. The lie protects the conscience of the killer.
It frames them as underdogs fighting a beast. It dehumanizes the victim. If he's a monster, you don't have to feel guilty about shooting him in the head.
Okay, so the poison is almost certainly a fabrication or a failure. What about the violence, the shooting, and that zombie run across the courtyard?
Let's go back to the autopsy. Let's look at the ballistics. Dr. Kozyrtov found 3 gunshot wounds.
Okay.
One in the left side of the chest, which entered the stomach and liver. A very serious wound. Fatal, eventually, but not instantly.
So he could have lingered.
He could have. There was another wound in the back, near the right kidney, which shattered the spine. And then there's a third one.
The headshot.
Right in the center of the forehead.
And the report on that one.
It was fired from very close range. There were powder burns on the skin, which means the muzzle of the gun was just inches away. This bullet entered the brain and, well, obliterated it.
Okay, so regardless of the sequence, once that forehead shot happens, the lights are out. There is no getting up. There is no scrambling on all fours. There is no strangling Yusupov.
Correct. The brain is destroyed. The story ends there. Now, historians debate the sequence, but the physical evidence strongly suggests the chest shot happened first, probably in the basement. Rasputin likely fell. He might have been alive for a few minutes lying on that bearskin rug.
Right?
But the chaotic running battle in the snow where he's shaking off bullets like a tank, It is highly, highly exaggerated. The spine shot alone would have paralyzed his legs. He wasn't running anywhere after that.
So that whole dramatic chase scene is theater.
It's pure theater. And the headshot was almost certainly the final act, an execution.
And what about the drowning? The water in the lungs part of the story that proves he was still alive.
Another core part of the myth that the autopsy completely debunks. The report is explicit. No sign of death by drowning. The lungs were not waterlogged. There was no frothy foam in the airways. He was dead before he hit the river.
But what about the arms? The story is so specific that his arms were frozen in a raised position, like he was clawing at the ice or making the sign of the cross.
That is likely due to rigor mortis, or just how the body was bundled and then settled in the current.
How so?
When they threw him off the bridge, they had wrapped him in a heavy curtain or a coat and tied it with rope. If the rope loosened in the current, or if the body snagged on something under the ice, the arms could have floated up and then frozen in that position. It looks dramatic, but it's just physics, not a last act of survival.
So if we strip away all the folklore, all the self-serving stories from Yusupov, what actually happened that night? Give me the real version, based on the evidence.
The real version is grim, gritty, and incredibly clumsy. Yusupov lures Rasputin to his palace. They probably sit there for hours trying to work up the nerve to kill him.
They're amateurs.
Total amateurs. Eventually, Yusupov shoots him in the chest. Rasputin falls. The conspirators panic. They're aristocrats, not hitmen. They don't know what they're doing. They think he's dead. Then maybe he groans or moves, which completely spooks them.
The jump scare was probably just a dying man's last reflex.
Almost certainly. So they drag him outside. They shoot him again, execution style, in the head to make sure he's dead. They wrap the body, drive to the Petrovsky Bridge, and dump him into a hole in the ice. End of story.
And they were bad at it, right? I mean, the cover-up was a disaster.
Oh, they were terrible criminals, just laughably bad. First, they forgot to weigh the body down so it didn't sink to the bottom. It got caught under the ice and was found very quickly.
Rookie mistake.
Then, they dropped one of Rasputin's galoshes, his rubber overshoes, on the bridge right next to a big, obvious bloodstain. The police found it the next morning.
It was like a trail of breadcrumbs.
And get this. When a local policeman heard the gunshots earlier in the night and came to the palace to investigate, Yusupov shot his own dog in the courtyard and dragged its body around to explain the blood and the noise.
He shot his dog.
Yep. Told the cop, oh, nothing to see here, officer, just had to put down a mad dog. It's just so messy. It is not a supernatural thriller. It is a botched hit carried out by nervous rich kids.
Exactly. And that messiness, that incompetence, is what they had to cover up later with the grand legend.
Precisely. They needed the legend of the unkillable monk to smooth over their own incompetence and their own brutality.
This leads us to the big why. Not just why they killed him, but why the myth stuck. Why do we, 100 years later, still want to believe the supernatural version? It's so much more compelling.
Because the truth is boring and depressing.
Yeah.
Rich men murder peasant advisor is a sad story about class, power, and violence. Holy patriots battle unkillable demon to save an empire is a story about the fate of nations. It feels significant. It feels epic.
It gives meaning to the meaningless.
And it served everyone's agenda at the time. It served Yusupov because it made him a hero who fought the devil. It served the church and the right wing because it confirmed their narrative that Rasputin was pure evil. It even served the Bolsheviks later on.
How so? I would think the communists would want to debunk all the mysticism and superstition.
You'd think so. But actually, the Bolsheviks loved the story because it showed how rotten, decadent, and superstitious the entire Tsarist regime was.
Oh, I see.
Their propaganda was essentially, look at these people. They are fighting wizards in basements while the country starves and loses a war. This is why they had to be overthrown. It fit their narrative perfectly.
So everyone gets to use the dead body for their own political agenda.
That is the definition of a historical symbol. The man dies, but the symbol becomes useful to everyone.
Okay, I want to talk about the fallout, the political aftermath. The conspirators thought this would save Russia. They thought, ding dong, the witch is dead, now everything goes back to normal.
It was a catastrophic miscalculation, and this is the great tragedy of the great man theory of history, or in this case, the bad man theory. They thought Rasputin was the cause of all of Russia's problems.
But he was just a symptom, a very visible, very weird symptom.
Exactly. Rasputin didn't cause the shortage of bread in the cities. He didn't cause the incompetence of the generals on the Eastern Front. He didn't create the centuries of inequality and peasant suffering. He was just a lightning rod for all that anxiety and anger.
And when they removed him,
They expected the lightning to stop. Instead, the storm just got worse.
How did the public react at the time? Was there cheering in the streets?
In the aristocratic salons of St. Petersburg, yes, absolutely. People drank champagne and toasted Yusupov as a national hero. He received fan mail. But among the peasantry,
Hmm?
the common people, the reaction was very, very different.
How so?
They saw it as the nobles killing one of us. Rasputin, for all his flaws, was still a peasant who had made it to the top. His murder reinforced the idea that the aristocracy was at war with the common people. It actually deepened the class divide right before the revolution.
It did the opposite of uniting the country.
The exact opposite. And for the Tsar and Empress, it completely destroyed them. Alexandra was devastated. She genuinely believed Rasputin was a holy man, the only thing keeping her hemophiliac son, Alexei, alive. When he died, she collapsed into grief and fatalism.
And the Tsar? Did it make him stronger, as the conspirators hoped?
No, it made him more isolated. He was furious that his own cousin Dmitri was involved. He sent the conspirators into exile, but he didn't prosecute them harshly, which alienated both sides. He was just lost. The last person he trusted was gone.
And the timeline here really speaks for itself, doesn't it?
It's chilling. Rasputin dies in late December 1916. In late February 1917, the revolution begins in the streets of Petrograd. By early March 1917, the Tsar abdicates. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for 300 years, collapsed less than 3 months after the Savior operation.
Wow, talk about a complete and utter backfire.
It's one of the great ironies of history. The act that was meant to save the monarchy probably hastened its destruction.
It proves that political assassination rarely solves structural problems. You can kill a man, but you can't kill the social forces that created him.
That is a powerful takeaway. We often look for scapegoats in politics. If we can just get rid of that guy or that group, everything will be fine.
But history says no, you have to look at the system.
Rasputin was the smoke. The house was already on fire. Killing him was like swatting at the smoke while the foundations burned.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the murder itself, let's just look at the takeaways. We have separated the myth from the facts.
We have. The facts are a brutal, messy, arguably unjustified murder of a man who was killed by a series of gunshots, most definitively by one to the head, with no credible evidence of poison involved.
But the myth is a supernatural battle between good and evil, featuring an unkillable monk who withstands poison, bullets, and being beaten before finally drowning under the ice.
And the myth survived because it was useful.
Useful how? Just to recap.
It was useful to the killers because it turned them from clumsy murderers into heroic exorcists. It was useful to the public because it gave them a simple explanation and a scapegoat for a nation's collapse. And it was useful to the elite because it allowed them to avoid responsibility. It wasn't our fault the country fell apart. It was the wizard.
A boring, ugly truth wouldn't survive, but a terrifying, epic story that lasts forever.
And that is why we're still talking about the poison in the ice today, over 100 years later. The story was just too good to die.
It really makes you question other historical legends, doesn't it? How many other great stories that we all know are just elegant cover-ups for messy, uncomfortable realities?
That is the question every learner of history should ask. When a story feels too perfect, too dramatic, too clean, look for the author. Find out who benefited from telling it that way.
Well, speaking of the story continuing, Rasputin is dead, the body has been pulled from the river. But as we've hinted, the myth was just getting started. His death was really the beginning of his legend.
Oh yes. In part 5, our final part, we are going to explore why this myth refused to die. How Grigory Rasputin became larger, more famous, and more infamous in death than he ever was in life. From the jar containing his allegedly preserved private parts.
Oh, we have to talk about that.
We do. All the way to that Boney M song and his status as a pop culture icon of mystical evil.
I can't wait for that deep dive. But for now, thank you for joining us on this one. We hope you look at the story of the Mad Monk's death a little differently now.
Keep questioning the narrative.
See you next time.
All right, I want you to just picture this scene. It's December 1916. The Neva River in St. Petersburg it's frozen solid, it's bleak, it's cold, and somewhere under all that ice is the body of Grigory Rasputin.
The man who supposedly couldn't be killed.
Exactly. He is finally physically dead. And you have the aristocracy, the very princes and grand dukes who plotted this whole thing. They're popping champagne. They think they've just performed, a surgical strike.
Right, they've removed the tumor.
Yes. They've removed the tumor that was killing Russia.
They really thought, problem solved, mission accomplished. They were expecting the sun to come out the next day and, I don't know, the war to just turn around.
But here's the massive, massive irony that frames our entire deep dive today. Rasputin, the man, was dead, but Rasputin, the story was just getting started.
That is the absolute crux of it. The sources we're looking at today, historical analyses, sociological studies of the revolution, they all point to this really counterintuitive idea. His death didn't end the chaos.
Not at all.
In fact, within weeks of his body being pulled from that river, the Russian monarchy collapses. The revolution kicks off. And the entire empire, which had stood for 300 years, it just disintegrates.
Which kind of suggests that maybe the Mad Monk wasn't the structural, load-bearing pillar of the empire that everyone thought he was.
Exactly. And that brings us to the real mission for this deep dive. We're not rehashing the murder. We did that. Today, we're asking why the legend of Rasputin went nuclear after he was dead. We're exploring this idea of the single point of failure.
Right. The idea that it's just easier to blame a wizard than, say, a grain shortage.
Precisely. So let's get into it.
Okay, so let's set the stage. Right after the murder, Rasputin is gone. But the sources describe the atmosphere in Petrograd not as relieved, but as frantic. Why?
Because the entire floor fell out from under the country. You have to remember what was going on in the background while everyone was obsessing over this one guy.
Yeah.
World War I is just grinding the Russian army into dust.
Right.
There's a massive ammunition shortage. The trains aren't running, which means food isn't getting into the cities. You have inflation running at something like 400%.
So if you're a regular person in 1917, a soldier in a trench or worker in a factory, your life is just objectively falling apart. You're not thinking about court intrigue, you're thinking about survival.
It's a total nightmare. And when you're in that level of distress, I mean, you're starving, you're watching your friends die, your children are hungry. The human brain just craves an explanation. It needs to know why. But the real answer is, it's incredibly boring and complex. It's logistics, it's socioeconomics, it's centuries of delayed agrarian reform.
And nobody wants to hear a lecture on agrarian reform when they're starving. They want a name. They want a face.
Right. And this is what the sources call simplifying the chaos. The human brain, it just struggles to process systemic failure. It feels too big, too abstract. It's like when your computer crashes. You don't want to hear about a complex conflict between the kernel and the motherboard voltage. You want to find the one corrupt file you can delete to fix everything.
And Rasputin was the corrupt file.
He was the perfect single point of failure. He allowed people to consolidate all of that misery, the war, the hunger, the politics, into one single narrative container. We aren't losing the war because of bad logistics. We're losing because the German spy in the palace is telling the Empress where to send our troops.
It turns a massive systemic issue into a simple character issue. There's a great line in one of the articles you sent me. Rasputin turned chaos into a character.
That is such a key insight. Characters are actionable. If the problem is the system, well, what do? You feel powerless against a system. But if the problem is a person, a villain, you just have to remove them.
But wait, here's where the logic just completely breaks down for me. They did remove him. Yusupov and his crew killed him. And things didn't get better.
They got so much worse.
So wouldn't that prove the theory wrong?
Logically, yes. But emotionally, no. And this leads us to the most fascinating part of the research. You would assume that once he was dead and the problems got worse, people would move on. But the opposite happened. The myth got louder.
Because, and this just blew my mind reading the notes, basically everyone benefited from the lie. It wasn't just one group spreading rumors. You had the aristocracy, the church, the revolutionaries.
And the general public.
All nodding along to this supervillain Rasputin story, but for completely different reasons.
It's a convergence of interests. It's wild. Let's just break them down because it shows you how a myth becomes really sturdy. So start with the aristocracy, the Grand Dukes, the people who actually murdered him. Why would they keep pumping up his legend?
Well, looking at their diaries from the time, it feels like a massive deflection. If the empire is collapsing because of some dark force, this supernatural saboteur, then it's not collapsing because the aristocracy has been incompetent for, 50 years?
Bingo. It absolves them. It lets them say, we would have been great leaders. We would have won the war. But alas, we were sabotaged by this evil genius. It turns them from being the perpetrators of a failed state into the victims of a spiritual hijacking.
It's the I didn't lose the game, the controller was broken defense.
Yes, essentially. Then you look at the church, the Russian Orthodox Church. They despised Rasputin, but they also used his myth.
This one feels a little trickier. Why would the church want to highlight a heretic?
Because the church itself was losing influence. They were seen as stagnant, bureaucratic, too close to the state. So by framing Rasputin as a demon or a member of that secret sex cult we talked about, the Callists,
Right.
they could frame the rot in the palace as an external infection.
So it's not that the church failed to guide the Tsar properly, it's that the devil broke in through the side door.
Exactly, it protects the institution. But the most effective, the most powerful use of the myth came from the people who eventually took over. The revolutionaries,
Yeah.
the Bolsheviks.
Now, you'd think the Bolsheviks, these hardline Marxists, atheists, they wouldn't care about court gossip or mystics. They deal in class struggle, not ghosts.
True, they didn't believe the supernatural stuff for a second, but they loved the utility of it. Lenin and his circle saw Rasputin as the ultimate propaganda weapon.
Because he was living proof of the rot at the top.
Exactly. If you're trying to convince millions of people to overthrow the Tsar, you have to destroy this idea of the divine right of kings. You have to
Okay.
show that the Tsar isn't God's chosen representative. He's just a confused guy taking orders from a dirty, illiterate peasant.
It just cheapens the whole monarchy. It takes the sacred right out of the equation.
It drags the monarchy down into the gutter. The Bolsheviks circulated these cartoons, some of them incredibly graphic, showing Rasputin as the puppet master with the Tsar and Tsarina on strings. Or worse, they didn't care if the rumors were true. They cared that the story destroyed respect for the system.
It makes the Tsar look weak. And in a time of war, a weak leader is unforgivable.
Correct. And then finally you have the public, the everyday people. Why did they buy into the wildest parts of the story? The orgies, the magical healing, the treason.
I think it goes right back to that idea of organizing your anger.
It does. Truth rarely satisfies everyone at the same time. But a convenient lie can work for everybody. If you're a peasant and you're told you're starving because that man in the palace is selling Russia's grain to the Germans, well, that gives you a target.
It makes the suffering feel purposeful in a twisted way. Like if we just get rid of him, we eat.
It's almost scary how usefulness just trumps accuracy. We keep the stories that do work for us.
And that brings us to the sticky factor.
Sure.
It wasn't just political utility. It was also just, well, a really good story.
Oh, absolutely. The sources list out the ingredients of the legend. You've got sex, religion, power, violence, supernatural elements. If you were pitching this as a Netflix series today, the executives would tell you to tone it down. It's too unrealistic.
It hits every single button.
Yeah.
And this is where we see that battle between sensationalism and evidence.
Mhm.
The sources make a really profound point here. Exaggeration sells better than nuance.
We see this so clearly in the autopsy reports versus the legend of his death. We spent a lot of time on this last time, but it's worth just restating the contrast.
Right.
The historical record, the actual autopsy, says he died of a bullet to the head. It's brutal, but it's mundane, a standard assassination. But the story says he ate enough cyanide to kill an elephant, got shot 3 times, was clubbed, and was still alive when they threw him in the river.
And the story is the version everyone knows. I mean, there's a Boney M song about it. There is not a disco hit about the Kosovo autopsy report.
No, there's not. And that's because primary sources, they just don't go viral. Autopsy reports are dry, they're clinical, they don't get whispered in taverns. But a story about a man who wouldn't die,
That implies something supernatural. That sticks.
it's the difference between information and folklore. Folklore has to be memorable to survive. It needs a hook.
And once a story becomes that entertaining, correcting it is almost impossible. The entertainment value just overrides the factual record. This is why every retelling of the Rasputin story pushed the narrative further and further from reality.
Right. It wasn't enough for him to be influential. He had to be all-powerful. It wasn't enough for him to be a sinner. He had to be the literal devil.
So eventually, the man just disappears completely. The sources talk about Rasputin becoming a cultural archetype. He stopped being Grigory Rasputin from Siberia and became Rasputin, the symbol.
Yeah. Think about it. Think about how many villains in fiction are modeled after him. The corrupt advisor whispering in the king's ear, the shadow behind the power.
Oh, I immediately think of Jafar from Aladdin, or Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings.
Jafar is the perfect example. The vizier with the cobra staff hypnotizing the sultan. That is pure Rasputin imagery. And once a figure becomes an archetype like that, the specific facts of their life become kind of irrelevant. They serve a function in our storytelling.
But I want to go back to the psychology of this for a second. because there's a section in the material that I found genuinely uncomfortable. It suggests that believing in supervillain Rasputin was actually a way for people to protect their faith in the Tsar.
This is the redeemable king theory, and it is absolutely crucial. This is maybe the most important takeaway from this whole stack of sources.
Okay, explain that. It sounds totally contradictory. How does believing the Tsar's best friend is a monster help the Tsar?
Think about it. If the Tsar is just incompetent, if he's just a bad leader who doesn't care about his people, that's a devastating realization for a Russian in 1916. The Tsar is the little father, God's representative. If he's just bad, then the whole world is broken.
Right, it's like realizing your parents don't know what they're doing, but on a cosmic scale.
Exactly. But what if the Tsar is a good man who has been bewitched by an evil sorcerer? Now, that's a salvageable situation. If Rasputin is the sole cause of the disaster, then the Tsar isn't incompetent, he's a victim. The monarchy isn't broken, it's just infected.
And if you remove the infection, the patient recovers.
Precisely. Believing in Rasputin's evil powers let people maintain hope that the system itself was still good. It was a coping mechanism. It let them love the Tsar while hating what was happening to their country.
But that implies that if you debunk the myth, if you look at the facts and realize, Rasputin wasn't running the country, he wasn't a German spy, he wasn't a sorcerer,
Then you are forced to accept the much harder, much colder conclusion. The system failed on its own. The Tsar was incompetent on his own. The collapse was inevitable, with or without Rasputin.
which means nobody was driving the bus, or the driver was asleep at the wheel.
Or the bus had no brakes to begin with. And that is a terrifying reality to accept. It suggests all the suffering was meaningless, or at least unavoidable.
This explains why people get so angry when historians try to correct the record. You see this in the comments sections of history videos all the time. People defend the myth so aggressively. No, he was a wizard. He did survive the poison.
They're defending the story. Because questioning the myth threatens the narrative they rely on to make sense of the world. If you take away the villain, you're left with chaos. And people hate chaos. The sources argue this isn't just about Rasputin. This is a universal human thing.
The source material calls it the modern echo.
Yes. We have to be really careful not to look at this as just some crazy Russian thing from 1917. We do this today, all the time. Whenever institutions fail, whenever trust collapses and fear rises, societies create villains to absorb the guilt. We look for the saboteur, we look for the puppeteer.
It's a defense mechanism against randomness. We would rather have a villain we can hate than a complex system we can't understand.
Clarity instead of complexity, blame instead of responsibility, narrative instead of uncertainty.
And Rasputin just happened to be the guy standing there when the music stopped.
He was perfectly cast. He looks the part, the beard, the piercing eyes, the peasant robes in a gilded palace. He acted the part, the cryptic warnings, the proximity to power. But if it hadn't been him, the Russian public likely would have just invented someone else to fill that void. The role of scapegoat was open, and he stepped into it.
That is a haunting way to put it. He was cast in a role he didn't realize he was playing until it killed him. And even after it killed him, he's still playing it.
And likely always will be. The myth is just too useful to discard.
So if we strip all of that away, if we acknowledge that the legend is mostly propaganda and confirmation bias and psychological coping, what are we left with?
We're left with a man. Just a man. And that leads to the final question, the one we've been dancing around this whole series.
Right. We've looked at his life, his rise, his murder, and now his afterlife as a legend. But there is one big moral question left that the sources tee up for our final deep dive.
It is the hardest question of all. Now that we've deconstructed the myth, we have to deliver a moral verdict.
Was Rasputin actually evil?
We know he wasn't the supernatural monster of the legend. We know he didn't have magic powers. But was he a bad man? Or was he just a victim of a society that desperately needed a villain?
It's the difference between being a monster and just being flawed, human.
And that forces us to look in the mirror a little bit. When we judge him, are we judging the man or are we judging the caricature that we've created?
And that is what we are going to tackle in the final part of this series. You really do not want to miss that one. It's going to be the verdict.
We're going to look at the evidence of his actual behavior, his kindness, his manipulation, his faith, his flaws, all without the filter of the revolution.
So just take a moment today. Think about the stories you tell yourself about why things go wrong in your own world. Are you looking for a reason? Or are you looking for a Rasputin?
Critical thinking is really the only defense against a convenient myth.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll see you for the finale. Welcome back to the deep dive. I have to say, sitting here today, it feels a little bit like we're at a funeral. Not necessarily for a person, though we are definitely going to talk about a dead body, but for an idea.
That is a very ominous way to start. Which idea are we burying today?
We are burying the idea that history is simple. We've spent 5 deep dives tracking Grigory Rasputin. It's been a marathon. We watched him walk out of the Siberian woods. We watched him charm the socks off the Romanovs. We saw him scandalize the church. And finally, in the last deep dive, we saw him get poisoned, shot, beaten, and drowned.
It has been a wild ride. We've covered the what, the where, and the how in, I think, exhaustive detail.
Today we have to tackle the why. And honestly, this feels like the hardest part because we have to answer the question that has been hanging over this entire series like a bad smell or a dark cloud.
Oh,
We have to answer. Was Rasputin truly evil?
it's the ultimate judgment, isn't it? And usually in history books, and especially in the true crime genre, this is where the gavel comes down. We pronounce guilt, we label the monster, and we walk away feeling, superior.
Exactly. It's the case closed moment. He was a monster, moving on. But the materials we are working through today, the research, the historical analysis, they're asking us to do something that is honestly kind of uncomfortable. They're suggesting that evil isn't a fact. It's a shortcut.
It is a very, very convenient shortcut.
The core mission for this deep dive is to see if we can separate the man from the myth. If we strip away the legend, the supernatural rumors, the political propaganda from 1916, is there actually a monster underneath? Or is there just a man?
And that is the central tension of this entire discussion. The premise we are working with is that the label evil is often used to stop a conversation rather than start one. If you label Rasputin evil, you don't have to understand the Russian Empire. You don't have to understand the psychology of the aristocrats who killed him. You just have a villain.
And the research teases the conclusion right up front, which I really appreciate because it sets the stakes. The answer isn't a simple yes or no.
No, not at all. The answer reveals much more about the society that hated him than it does about the man himself.
So let's unpack this. I want to start with this concept, the problem with the label evil. Why is the research so skeptical of this word? I mean, evil exists, right?
It does, but think about how we use the word in our daily lives or in media. The research posits that evil is an easy word. It's a mechanism. We use it specifically when we are frightened. We use it when behavior feels deeply, viscerally wrong to us. And most importantly, we use it when outcomes are catastrophic.
That last one really sticks with me. When outcomes are catastrophic. And if we look at the end of the Romanov dynasty, catastrophic is, it's barely strong enough to describe it.
It was the end of a world. You have the collapse of a 300-year-old dynasty. You have a world war that is grinding millions of men into meat. You have a revolution. You have the execution of the royal family. It's hell on earth.
And the human brain struggles with that kind of scale, doesn't it?
Precisely. The human brain craves a cause that matches the magnitude of the effect. If the result is the destruction of an empire, we cannot accept that the cause was something mundane like, bad supply chain logistics or an incompetent monarch.
Right. The train schedules were messed up isn't a satisfying explanation for the apocalypse.
Exactly. We want a cause that equals the horror. If the result was hell, the cause must have been a demon. We need a monster to explain the monstrosity of the event.
So in history and true crime, labeling someone evil simplifies complex events. It turns a tragedy into a morality play.
It creates a binary. Good versus evil. If the empire fell, it must be because the devil was in the palace. And our goal today is to be precise. We have to resist that urge. We need to define exactly what we mean by evil before we try to stick that label on Rasputin.
And to do that, we have to start by deconstructing the mythology. The research points out something really interesting about the historical record. By the time Rasputin is fully recorded, by the time people are really writing about him in diaries and newspapers, he's already a caricature.
He is. He is almost never written about as a human being. He enters the historical record as a symbol. If you look at the sources from that time, the diaries of the politicians, the cartoons in the papers, the descriptors are relentlessly consistent. Immoral, manipulative, corrupting, dangerous.
It's like his character sheet was written by his enemies before he even walked onto the stage.
In many ways it was, but here is where we have to be intellectually honest. We can't swing too far the other way and pretend he was an angel who was just, misunderstood. The research admits, and we have to acknowledge, that there is a kernel of truth to these accusations.
We can't let him off the hook completely. Let's look at the rap sheet. The research is very clear on this. First off, alcohol.
A massive amount of it. This isn't just a glass of wine with dinner. We are talking about legendary binges. He was famous for his love of sweet Madeira wine. He would go to the music halls and the bathhouses and drink until he could barely stand.
And this wasn't done in private, was it?
No, and that's a key part of it. He was public. He would be seen stumbling out of the Yar restaurant, which was the hotspot in Moscow, shouting and singing.
Then there's the second charge, sexual impropriety.
Also undeniably true, based on the records we have. He engaged in sexual relationships that violated the social norms of the time. He solicited prostitutes. He propositioned society ladies who came to him for spiritual healing.
And the third thing, pride. He enjoyed the attention.
Yeah.
He loved the influence.
He loved it. He wasn't a humble hermit hiding in a cave. He flaunted his access to the Tsar. He showed off the shirts the Empress embroidered for him. He leaned into the fame.
But we have a guy who drinks until he passes out, sleeps around, and brags about his powerful friends. The research asks a deep dive analysis question here. Why do these facts matter?
They matter because they establish that he wasn't a saint. He was messy. He was flawed. He was a sinner in the very traditional sense of the word. He was not a good guy.
But, and this is the pivot point of the entire argument, we have to look at the context. The research challenges us to ask, were these behaviors unique to Rasputin?
And if you know anything about the Russian aristocracy and the twilight of the empire, the answer is a resounding no.
I feel like debauchery was basically the job description for a Grand Duke.
It practically was. Let's look at the people judging him. Take Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, one of the men who eventually murdered Rasputin, or Grand Duke Boris. These men were notorious. They were alcoholics. They hosted wild parties that lasted for days. They had affairs with ballerinas and actresses that were open secrets.
So if a Grand Duke gets drunk at the Yar restaurant and dances on a table, what do people say?
They say he is spirited. They say he is eccentric. They say, oh, that's just the Romanovs being Romanovs. It's treated with a wink and a nudge.
But when a peasant from Siberia does the exact same thing,
it becomes demonic. It becomes proof that he is the Antichrist. The behavior is identical, but the judgment is completely different.
that is the distinction. The research asks, if others did these things, why is Rasputin singled out?
It forces us to realize that the evil label wasn't really about the drinking or the sex. It was about class. It was about boundaries.
He was crossing a line, a social line.
Exactly. Rasputin's crime wasn't just that he was sinful. It was that he was a peasant behaving like a prince. He looked the aristocracy in the eye and didn't blink. He spoke to the Empress like she was his equal. That was the unforgivable sin.
So was he uniquely destructive? Or was it just convenient to exaggerate his sins because he was an outsider?
The evidence strongly suggests the latter. He was an easy target because he didn't belong. He broke the rules of the club.
This is crucial. It shifts the conversation from morality to sociology, really. But let's go deeper. The research suggests we use a specific framework to evaluate evil, a legal framework, actually, intent versus consequence.
I think this is the most helpful way to parse this. In law, we talk about mens rea, the guilty mind. To be truly evil, or at least to be a villain in the narrative sense, you usually need intent. You need malice. You need to wake up in the morning and plan to do harm.
So the questions we need to ask are, did he intentionally seek to harm others? And did he deliberately manipulate the Russian state for his own personal gain?
And when we review the record, the actual historical record, not the rumors spread by his enemies, it does not clearly support malicious intent.
Wait, really? Because the popular image is of him like a puppet master, pulling the strings to destroy Russia from the inside?
That is the myth. But look at the facts. Did he design state policy? No. He didn't write the laws. He didn't draft the treaties. He couldn't even read and write properly for most of his life.
So he wasn't in the war room drawing up battle plans.
Of course not. Did he order executions? No. He wasn't signing death warrants. He wasn't running a secret police force.
What about the war? That's the biggest disaster of the time. There were rumors he was a German spy, right? That he was deliberately sabotaging the war effort.
Those rumors were everywhere. People were convinced he was working for the Kaiser to destroy Russia from the inside. But the archives were opened after the revolution. The Bolsheviks would have loved to prove the Tsarina was sleeping with a German spy. It would have been perfect propaganda. And you know what they found?
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing. No German gold. No secret letters to Berlin. In fact, the complete opposite. Rasputin was a pacifist. He begged the Tsar not to go to war in 1914.
He tried to stop it.
He telegraphed the Tsar saying, "Don't do this. It will be the end of Russia and the end of you." That is not the action of a man trying to destroy the empire. If he were truly evil and wanted the Romanovs to fall, he would have cheered for the war.
That is a huge point. His intent was actually to save the regime,
Yeah.
even if his advice was ignored.
Exactly. And let's look at the money. This is another area where the evil mastermind trope just completely falls apart.
You'd expect him to be looting the treasury, right? Building a secret lair with all his stolen gold.
You would. But the research notes that he did not profit financially on the massive scale of corruption that surrounded him. Look, there were ministers taking bribes for artillery contracts that were worth millions of rubles. There were grand dukes skimming off the top of the Navy budget. The system was rotten with graft.
And Rasputin.
He took gifts. People would give him shirts or cases of wine or rolls of cash to get a meeting with him, hoping he'd put in a good word. He lived comfortably. But when he died, he wasn't sitting on a mountain of gold. He didn't have offshore accounts. He had like a few hundred rubles in his pocket. Most of the money he got, he gave away to other peasants or spent on drink.
So he wasn't a Bond villain building a laser base. He was just a grifter living day to day.
He was a survivor. So if he wasn't a mastermind trying to destroy the country, and he wasn't a thief trying to steal the treasury, what was the nature of his influence?
The research characterizes it as informal, emotional, and indirect.
Informal, emotional, and indirect. That sounds annoying. It sounds chaotic. But does it sound evil? Does it sound like a deliberate plot?
That's the verdict on intent. The lack of direct malice complicates the accusation. I mean, if I am clumsy and I knock over a priceless vase, I have caused destruction. But am I evil?
Rasputin was certainly more than clumsy. He was reckless. He was an opportunist. But the research argues that he wasn't a villainous mastermind plotting the downfall of the Romanovs. He was just a guy who got access to power and didn't know how to handle it responsibly.
This clarification is important. It doesn't make him innocent. It doesn't make him a good person. It just shifts the conversation.
It shifts it from he is a demon to he is a liability, a massive system-breaking liability.
Which leads us perfectly into the next section, systemic failure versus personal malice. Because even if he didn't mean to burn the house down, the house still burned down.
Exactly. And we have to ask, was it the match's fault? Or was it the fact that the house was soaked in gasoline? The research argues that the real danger Rasputin posed wasn't malice, it was a lack of boundaries.
Power without structure.
Yes. Think about the space he occupied. He had no official title. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a minister. He wasn't a general.
He was just our friend. What was his title?
Our friend. And yet, he had the ear of the absolute ruler of one of the largest empires on Earth. That is the very definition of power without structure.
Why is that specifically so dangerous? I mean, lots of leaders have informal advisors.
Because power without a formal container is inherently unstable. In a functional government, you have chains of command, you have checks and balances. If a minister of agriculture messes up, you can fire him. There's a process. If a general loses a battle, you court-martial him. There is accountability.
Oh, with Rasputin.
There was no process. There was no accountability. His power was based entirely on the personal, emotional feelings of the Empress Alexandra. You can't regulate that. You can't oversee that. And you can't challenge it without challenging the Empress herself, which no one dared to do.
So the instability he caused wasn't because he was waking up every morning thinking, how could I ruin the government? It was because his mere presence short-circuited the entire system.
Precisely. It is a systemic failure. The system of the autocracy was so fragile, so brittle, so dependent on the personal whim of the monarch that one charismatic peasant could destabilize the whole thing.
It's like a computer system with no firewall. You can't blame the virus for getting in. You have to blame the security architecture that let it happen.
That is a perfect analogy. And because the system couldn't handle him, because it had no formal way to contain him, it triggered a reaction. The research calls it the moral panic effect.
I love this term, moral panic. We see this in history. We see it today. How does it apply to Rasputin?
It's a feedback loop, a vicious circle. Once Rasputin was labeled immoral or evil by the press and the aristocracy, every single thing he did confirmed that label.
It's confirmation bias on steroids.
Exactly. The research breaks down the progression. Rumors harden into facts. Exaggeration becomes proof. And this is the key phrase. Reputation replaces evidence.
Reputation replaces evidence. That is terrifying.
It means that in that environment, the accused doesn't need to actually do harm. They only need to exist. Their existence is the crime.
If people believe you are the devil, then everything you do is devilish. If you drink tea, it's sinister. If you pray, it's blasphemy. If you heal the Tsarevich, you must be using black magic.
Exactly. There were stories that he was having orgies in the palace nursery. There were stories that he and the Empress were German agents signaling troop movements to the enemy from the palace roof. Were these true? Of course not. They were absurd. But did people believe them? Absolutely.
And because they believed them, the damage was real. It didn't matter if it was true.
Rasputin's crime, in the eyes of the public, was crossing social boundaries. But society's reaction was punishment via reputation destruction. If they couldn't physically remove him, at least not at first, they would destroy him with stories. They would turn him into a monster.
Which brings us to the mechanism of that destruction, the scapegoat.
The research calls this the most important question of the deep dive. Why did so many people need Rasputin to be evil?
Note the word need. It wasn't just an observation, it was a psychological necessity.
Yes. Let's look at who was doing the hating. You had the elites, the Grand Dukes, the politicians in the Duma, and you had the general public. What did they get out of Rasputin being the villain?
Let's unpack the utility of it. The research argues that if Rasputin is the sole evil, then three very convenient things happen. First, it saves the monarchy, paradoxically.
Right. It seems counterintuitive. How does blaming the Tsar's best friend save the Tsar?
Because if Rasputin is a dark source bewitching the Tsar, then the Tsar isn't incompetent. He's just a victim. It means the monarchy is failing due to corruption and external force, not because Nicholas II is a fundamentally weak and indecisive leader who is bad at his job.
I see. It maintains the illusion of the good Tsar. If only the Tsar knew what Rasputin was doing, he would stop it.
Exactly. It's a classic Russian trope that goes back centuries. The Tsar is good, the advisors are bad. Blaming Rasputin allowed monarchists to keep believing in the system, even as it was crumbling around them.
So what's the second utility? Who else benefits?
The elites. It absolved the elites. If Rasputin is the monster, then the Grand Dukes and the generals and the ministers are victims of a charlatan, not active participants in the decay.
We aren't the ones running the country into the ground. It's that dirty monk from Siberia.
Right. It allows them to wash their hands of responsibility. We would have won the war, but the monk interfered. The economy would be stable, but the monk appointed his cronies. It's a perfect excuse for their own failures.
And the third utility? For the public.
For the public, it provides a simple narrative. The collapse of the empire has a specific villain, rather than a complex web of causes like, industrialization, political unrest, military defeat.
All the hard stuff, all the complicated stuff. This is what the research calls the seduction of simplification.
Yes. Simplification is seductive. The research puts it perfectly. It creates a binary world. Good empire versus bad monk.
Because if the problem is just bad monk, then the solution is easy.
Get rid of the monk.
But if the problem is the autocracy is an outdated system of government that cannot manage a modern industrial state combined with a rigid class structure, endemic corruption, and an incompetent administration,
then you have a much, much harder problem to solve.
eh,
One requires a bullet, the other requires a revolution.
it's always easier to blame a person than a system.
Always. And this applies to how you as the listener understand history and even current events. We always look for the bad guy. Because if there is a bad guy, we can just remove him and everything will be okay.
Which brings us to the control group test. I love that the research applies a bit of scientific logic here. It's a fantastic mental model.
It's a brilliant way to test the historical hypothesis. The hypothesis of the assassins, Prince Yusupov and his friends, was basically this. Rasputin is the cancer killing the empire.
So the test is, remove the cancer.
If he was the core problem, his removal should have cured, or at least stabilized, the patient. The body politic should have started to heal.
So let's look at the timeline. This is crucial. Rasputin is murdered on the night of December 30th, 1916.
Right. The dark force is gone. The German spy is dead in the river. By the logic of the scapegoat, January 1917 should have been the beginning of the recovery.
The streets should have calmed down. The food shortages in Petrograd should have been addressed. The army on the front lines should have improved morale. The government should have become more stable.
And what actually happened?
Everything fell apart. Faster.
It accelerated. The chaos didn't stop, it exploded. Within less than 3 months, by March 1917, the Tsar had abdicated. The Romanov dynasty was gone. Forever.
So removing Rasputin didn't save the patient?
It might have actually killed the patient faster. How so?
Because Rasputin was a lightning rod? He absorbed all the hate, all the criticism, all the fear. People could say, I hate Rasputin, instead of saying, I hate the Tsar. Or even worse, I hate the Tsarina.
But once the lightning rod is gone,
The lightning strikes the roof. Once Rasputin was dead, the public looked at Nicholas and Alexandra and said, wait a minute. The monk is dead, but we are still hungry. The war is still losing. The government is still a mess. Maybe the problem wasn't the monk. Maybe the problem is you.
that is a powerful realization. The scapegoat was actually a shield. His death exposed the monarchy directly to the rage of the people.
Exactly. The conclusion of the control group test is clear. This strongly suggests Rasputin was not the core problem. It doesn't absolve him of his flaws.
No, he was still a mess. He was still a reckless, destabilizing force.
But it exonerates him of being the singular cause of the collapse. He was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was the autocracy itself.
So we arrive at what the research calls a more honest conclusion. But it warns us it's an unsatisfying truth.
Honest answers often are, aren't they? We want the movie ending where the villain is defeated and the sun comes out. But the honest answer regarding Rasputin's morality is messy. It's gray.
Let's summarize the verdict. The research acknowledges his faults clearly. He was flawed. He was reckless. He was morally inconsistent.
He exploited belief and attention. He absolutely enjoyed the influence he had, an influence he didn't earn and didn't deserve. We cannot strip that away from him. He was not a good person in the conventional sense.
But simultaneously, we have to acknowledge the circumstances that created him.
He was a product of desperation, the desperation of a mother, the empress, trying to save her hemophiliac son, the desperation of a czar who was isolated from his people and couldn't trust his own ministers.
He was elevated by fear.
And he was destroyed by projection. All the fears, all the anger, all the anxieties of a dying society were projected onto this one man.
The research uses a metaphor here that I think captures it perfectly. It asks us to think of Rasputin as a mirror.
Yes. Contrast that with the mastermind. He wasn't the architect of the fall. He wasn't the one who designed the collapsing building. He was the mirror on the wall, reflecting the cracks that were already there.
He reflected the society around him rather than creating it. The corruption, the superstition, the political instability, the hypocrisy, it was all already there. He just made it visible.
He was a peasant who acted like a lord. He was a holy man who acted like a sinner. He held up a mirror to the aristocracy and showed them their own their own moral decay.
And people usually hate the mirror when they don't like the reflection.
So they smashed the mirror, they killed Rasputin, hoping it would change their face, hoping it would make the empire beautiful and noble again.
But smashing the mirror doesn't fix the face. Killing Rasputin didn't save Russia.
It just left them alone with the ugly reality they had been trying so desperately to ignore.
And this brings us to the meta-commentary. The research connects this story to the genre of true crime and modern storytelling, which I find fascinating.
It asks us to look beyond history. True crime usually asks one question. Who did it? Who held the gun? Who bought the poison? Who dumped the body?
But the deeper question identified by the research, the one Rasputin's story forces us to confront is, why do we need someone to blame?
We discussed this with the scapegoat, but the research takes it a step further here. It talks about how societies transform people into symbols in order to justify violence against them.
This is the dark side of storytelling.
It is. It's a dangerous process. Once you remove the complexity, once Rasputin isn't a flawed, complicated human being anymore, but just a symbol of evil, then any violence against him feels justified. It feels necessary.
We saw that in the murder.
Yeah.
The sheer brutality of it. Torture, poison, shooting, beating, drowning. It wasn't just an execution, it was an exorcism.
And the assassins felt righteous. Prince Yusupov didn't feel like a murderer. He felt like St. George slaying the dragon, because in his mind, he wasn't killing a man. He was killing a monster to save Russia.
That is the danger of removing complexity. It dehumanizes. And once you dehumanize someone, anything goes.
And that leads to the final irony of the whole story.
The utter futility of his assassination.
He was killed to save a system that was, in the words of the research, already beyond saving. It was a gesture of pure desperation.
His death brought no clarity, no stability.
Only myth. And this is the most powerful takeaway for me. The research says myth proved more durable and powerful than the truth.
The myth of the monster swallowed the reality of the man.
Think about it. Today, over 100 years later, what do people know about Rasputin? They know the song, Rara Rasputin. They know the beard. They know the unkillable monk who survived poison and bullets.
They know the caricature, the symbol of evil.
The myth survived. The man is forgotten. The complex, messy, flawed human being is gone. and only the monster remains.
Which leads us to the outro. The research leaves us with a haunting thought about what survived and what didn't.
Rasputin the man, the biological entity, the collection of cells, did not survive poison, bullets, and the icy water of the Neva River. He died.
But Rasputin the monster, the mythology, the story, survived and thrived.
Why? Why did the lie survive when the man died?
Because stories that protect power, simplify guilt, and offer up convenient villains are useful.
They're incredibly useful. They allow us to make sense of a chaotic world without having to look at the difficult structural problems or maybe our own complicity.
The research ends with a provocation for us, for you listening. It says these stories wait in the wings, and they return whenever a society is in crisis and needs someone to blame.
It's a reminder to question the villains in our own narratives. When we see someone being painted as the ultimate evil, the sole cause of a complex problem, we should pause. We should ask, is this a man or is this a mirror? Are we trying to solve a problem or are we just smashing the mirror to avoid looking at the reflection?
That is a powerful place to leave it. We spent 6 parts diving into the life of a Siberian peasant who brought an empire to its knees, or so the story goes. But in the end, I think we learned more about the empire and maybe about ourselves than we did about him.
The man is gone. The questions remain.
Thank you for taking this journey with us. It's been a wild ride through the snow, the palaces, and the dark waters of the Neva.
Indeed. It has been a pleasure.
Keep questioning the narrative. We'll see you in the next deep dive.
Goodbye.